All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have Ethan Hunt with me. He's been a listener for about a year, he said. He's a native of California, and I'm not going to talk too much about him. I'm going to let him introduce himself here, but we're really excited to have him on here. He's kind of helping me trailblaze here. We're kind of being pioneers, not like this, nobody's ever done this before, but it's new to me. And because of this episode, which will be published probably both on YouTube and on the podcast, it'll open the door for me to get to be able to do this more often. So I appreciate Ethan not only for being on here as a guest and sharing his knowledge with us, but also for helping me progress in my tech capabilities. It took us a while to get up and going, but we did it, made it work. And Ethan, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of information about your background and where you're coming from, and maybe include in there how you got into the subject of Scottish clans.
Yeah, thank you so much, Clint. Thank you for having me on. It's really exciting to be here. As far as my background, I grew up, as you kind of mentioned, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, which actually will play into how I'm interested in the Scottish clans. But a little bit about me now. I am a graduating senior at the University of California, Davis. I'm double majoring in genetics and genomics in Spanish, and I'm also pre-med, so the end goal is to become a doctor. But genealogy and Scottish clans in general has been a passion of mine. It's something I do on the side, but I haven't really decided where I want to take it, but it's something that I'm really interested in, especially on an academic level. So just kind of seeing where that goes. And then as far as how I got interested in the Scottish clans, so the city I'm actually from is Pleasanton in the Bay Area. And for some reason, I'm sure most of the people listening have never heard of Pleasanton, but Pleasanton has a very large Scottish Highland Gathering and Games. If you actually Google Scottish Highland Gathering and Games and you look at the Wikipedia page, it says that the Pleasanton one is the largest in the world in terms of spectators. Wow. So there's one in Scotland that has more more competitors. But I think the 155th annual games was 6 years ago. And there was, I think if you look, it says 50,000 spectators. So for some reason, yeah, Pleasanton has a very large gathering. And my mom's maiden name is Dinning. It's spelled like winning with a D. So their family immigrated to the US from Kilmarnock in the lowlands in the 1880s. So that kind of got me into the Scottish games. So I've been going ever since I was really young. And I really wanted, there's a racetrack, like horse racing at the fairgrounds in Pleasanton. And so there's always a kilted mile. So everyone runs a mile. The only requirement is you wear a kilt. And I'm not a very good runner, but I thought it was so cool. And I really wanted a kilt, and all these people flying from Scotland, Australia, everywhere, talking about their rich family history. And I really wanted to be a part of it. And so I asked my dad, I said, Dad, like, what clan are we a part of? And on his side of the family, the only one he knew at the time was his grandmother's maiden name is Wilson. And if you go and you look in the tartan books, the Wilson kilt was green and pink. I wasn't a big fan of green and pink at like 8 years old. And so I asked him if there are any other options. And because Dinning wasn't really, if you just look in the general books, Dinning isn't really a part of the clan. And he said, well, no, but I guess you'll have to research our family. And so I was 10 at the time, this is 2011. And that kind of like everything took off from there. I started just on genealogy, wanting to know what clans I was related to so I could buy a kilt. And now it's just kind of progressed, and I've learned so much more about what a Scottish clan is. I think a lot of stuff back then, I had a lot of misconceptions. What a clan is, how DNA is incorporated. I still don't have a kilt. That's coming. But yeah, that's kind of been my journey with genealogy and Scottish clans.
That is awesome, man. There's a lot of things that I connected with when you were describing that. I mean, I spent a lot of my, I've always figured, kind of fancied myself somebody who knew a lot about the subject, but it was mostly the stuff that you can skim off of a Google search, and which is all the same stuff regurgitated. And so I was like, I would say, I was going to say a mile wide and an inch deep, but it was more like a foot wide and an inch deep, because a mile wide would have been way overstating it. But it was when I had to get into my master's thesis, and I had to, you're supposed to, and you're in college right now, you're supposed to challenge, like, if I say this in my paper, what backup? Like, how do I support that? Is this a well-known fact that you don't need a cite? Like, this is just general knowledge? Or if I say this, am I asserting something that takes a little bit of some, and in doing that, and with the thesis, I really had to examine, like, is this even solid? Is this even legit? Or is this anyway? But it definitely pushed me into it. And that's kind of the foundation for this podcast. So I think a lot of people with what you're going to share today is going to, they're going to, I think they're going to really connect with it. So we're going to get into talking about DNA. And well, one quick thing before that, Kilmarnock. I have Boyds in my family tree, and they were I don't know when the earldom was created, but the Earls of Kilmarnock. That used to be called, I think it's called Dean Castle, but it's there just on the outskirts of Kilmarnock, which is near Ayr, isn't it? Dear,
Yeah, I believe Kilmarnock is in Ayrshire,
yeah,
the county, and I
right.
think it's close.
And then one thought on Dinning is, I don't know for sure because I've never really researched that, but I do have another family name that in my family tree is called Glendinning, or sometimes it's spelled Glendenning. Anyway, they're closely associated with the Douglases, and they come from the border country, and they're sometimes listed in those lists that you see of, and those are fairly historical. Like, they made records, like, here's the families that we have problems with on the borders, and they're in
Right,
those
I remember
lists.
talking about that.
Yeah. So anyway, cool. Let's talk about, let's get into this, basics. I'm following everybody. I'm following an outline that Ethan submitted to me. He said, take a look at this, see what you think. We'd already bounced the idea of doing this back and forth. And I said, yeah, give me some ideas of how you want to do this. Cause he's the one that knows. I have not gone super deep into DNA. I have touched on it, but I'm not authorized to really say much on this. And I'm just kind of going to go off of some of the things that Ethan said. Here's kind of a logical way to, and Ethan, we can stick close to it, or we can depart from it wherever the conversation takes us. Basically, everybody just is going to get to listen to me and Ethan nerd out with DNA as the foundation of the conversation here. So basics, what is DNA? What types of DNA testing are offered? How does testing work? And what is a haplogroup? Touch on some of those.
Yeah, of course. So to start off, that's 4 questions. I want to make sure I describe that accurately. So at any time, I'm kind of inundated with this stuff for my classes. So if I say something that's like too sciencey or like doesn't make sense, like please interrupt me, uh, so that everyone, the listeners, can understand, and for you as well. So first of all, what is DNA? It's probably the question people are most familiar with. DNA, I think in the simplest terms, is the unit of heredity that we all have. So it's what makes us human or any species what they are. Um, and so there are 3 types of DNA, more or less, which kind of goes into DNA testing. So the most common, when you see commercials for DNA testing, typically it's Ancestry DNA. They kind of do the best job of putting themselves out there on television. But there's the other company, 23andMe, people are really familiar with, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. Most of the time when people are talking about those tests, they're autosomal DNA tests. And so what that means is that for humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and a chromosome is basically a large collection of DNA. And so 22 of those pairs are called your autosomes, and the 23rd pair is called your sex chromosomes. And so for men, they have an X and a Y chromosome, and for women, they have 2 X's. And so when you take an autosomal test, that test is looking at your 22 autosomes, the first 22 pairs of chromosomes that you have. And the significance of this is that those chromosomes do not follow a special inheritance pattern. So when we talk about you get 50% from your parents and 25% from your grandparents, what you're really talking about is your autosomes. Um, and so that happens because of recombination, a certain process. But that's the majority of tests that people are familiar with. But there's actually two other types of DNA testing that is a little more targeted, and it gives you less overall information, but when used correctly, it's very beneficial. So the other two kinds are Y DNA testing, which if it sounds like Y chromosome, it's because it is. It tests specific DNA on your Y chromosome. And the significance of that is the Y chromosome is only passed down from father to son. And in Western tradition, surnames are also inherited from father to son. So basically, what that allows you to have is a genetic test for your surname. So that doesn't work in all cases. I mean, like across all cultures, but for Scottish clans and most surnames in Western Europe, that's how it works. And so what you end up with is your DNA matches with Y DNA testing should all have your surname. And because it's Y chromosome, it's on the Y chromosome, you actually know how you're related. At some point, your father's 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 father, however many generations back, is the same person. It's up to you to figure out how many generations back that is. Um, and then the last type of DNA testing is called mitochondrial DNA testing. And that is a specific part of your DNA that's actually not part of your 23 pairs of chromosomes. Um, and that part of your DNA, like I said, is independent from your genomic DNA, and it's inherited strictly from, it's passed down from mother to daughter. So as a male, it's basically the opposite of the Y DNA. So your Y DNA follows your, it's what's called your patriline. So like your father's 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 side, and your mitochondrial DNA follows your matriline, which is your mother's 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 side.
Cool.
So
So
I don't. Yeah, go ahead.
a question on that. So mitochondrial DNA, can I get a mitochondrial DNA of my female line? I just can't pass it on to the next one as a male, or do I like am I a blank? I mean, is it just not even there? It's
Yes.
there in me, right?
Yeah. So the first is, so all men have mitochondrial DNA. You just can't pass it on.
Gotcha.
But no female has a Y chromosome, and only
Okay.
males can pass on the Y chromosome.
So it's not the Y DNA and the mitochondrial. They're not mirror images of each other as far as how they work.
Right.
And another just a comment in, or when you're talking about the Y DNA theoretically should follow the male line, but then you have things like some people are surprised because there's a non-patrilineal or a non what's it called, a non-paternal
It, non-paternity event. Yeah.
non-paternity event. But you got to have a, now that's not always an affair. Sometimes it is.
Right.
Sometimes it was, I was listening to actually just recently, like yesterday while I was working out, which this is weird stuff to listen to while you're working out, but an Irish gentleman on YouTube talking about the Dalgash clans
Oh yeah.
tribal network, and he did bring something up. It was interesting because sometimes, and we do see this with like Seaton and Gordon and then Sutherland. You kind of hop from one to the other, and those are not following the male line. So the Earls of Huntley, the actual Gordon male line ran out. This is how I understand it. And if I'm getting this wrong, and the Gordons and Seatons and Sutherlands can all like send me hate messages, but the way I understand it is the Gordon male line ran out, but the heiress who had married a Seaton, and the rule was if their offspring were to carry the earldom of Huntley or the lordship, I don't know if it was an earldom yet, maybe it was, but if that was going to continue through that line, they'd have to change their name to Gordon. And so the
Yeah.
subsequent Earls of Huntley, or the people who took the Gordon name, are actually in the male line Seatons. And then you have a Gordon who marries a Sutherland heiress, and he both gets the earldom of Sutherland, and he, contrary to what this version of this with the Rosses, he becomes the head of the kindred with a little bit of contest originally from other people who thought they were better and more legitimate fit for that. But eventually, so you have Seton becomes Gordon becomes Sutherland if you chase the right line through female lines. But I mean, I think it's good that you establish the rule. You got to get that settled before you start talking about exceptions. The rule is theoretically this would follow a surname.
Yeah, and I'll actually talk about a little later.
Okay, good.
Scientists have calculated the non-paternity event rate, or like about what it is per
Oh,
generation.
really?
Yeah, so I'll talk about that a little bit later as we
Awesome.
get down.
I'll stand off
Just
then
to
from that.
no worries. Just to continue on, because I think those four questions are important for the groundwork
Mm-hmm.
of the rest of it. How does DNA testing work? I think this is really important, particularly when people are talking about ethnicity estimates, like I was this percentage, whatever, Scandinavian or something. Um, so what they do is they take a reference population or people that they have decided by some metric. Typically, it's like all four grandparents were born in the same X number of mile vicinity, and they'll take a group of those people and say that this is what we are defining as Scottish or English or Norwegian or Danish or whatever. And then when you test, they compare you to those other people and they assign you percentages. And so, what are they actually comparing when they do that? And this will be kind of important when we get into why DNA testing. So, the most common, I don't know what to call it, the most common like genetic marker that they're looking at is called it's a single nucleotide polymorphism, which is a long phrase. It's commonly abbreviated as SNP, spelled SNP.
Okay.
Uh, and to break that down, so single nucleotide. So most people or many people might be familiar with your DNA is made of four letters, so your A, C, G, and T. And so each one of those is called a nucleotide. So single nucleotide, polymorphism, poly meaning many, and then morphism meaning kind of like a mutation. And so what a SNP basically is a change in a letter in your DNA that is indicative of a population. So they might say that English people at this one part of your DNA have a C, but everyone else in the world has an A. So then when they look at your DNA, they say, oh, like Clint, you have a C, then they assign that certain portion as English to you. Um, and so that's the main way it works. In why DNA testing, there is SNP testing, which is the way I just described. And then this is kind of older and it's slowly becoming outdated, but it's still very much used because it's cheaper. There's SNP testing, and then there's STR testing. And STR stands for short tandem repeat. And I'll also break that down. So repeat is a sequence of letters. So it might be like ACT. And then short tandem repeat means that ACT repeats, like, let's say 10 times in a row, hence the tandem aspect. And so scientists have also decided or determined that the amount of times these certain places repeat can also be indicative of a population the same way that a SNP can be indicative of a population.
So if you use those two concepts that you just explained, the SNP and the, what was the other one called?
STR.
Okay, so if you take those two, do they do they use them together to refine the picture?
So what they're finding now, which is why STR testing is slowly becoming outdated, is that it is easier to get what's called convergence in STR testing. So it's possible for a repeat to occur the same number of times in two individuals by chance with mutation. So, like, let's say someone initially had 11 repeats of a certain sequence and it got mutated to where one was lost, so there's only 10, and a second individual had 9, and there was a duplication, and now they have 10. Both of those people now have 10, but historically, like ancestrally, their lineages are different. And it's very hard. So often you can get false positives with
Mm.
STR testing. And so SNP testing is slowly becoming more widespread. And it only got introduced. Uh, Family Tree DNA is the only big company that offers Y DNA testing and mitochondrial DNA testing. The rest of the companies only do autosomal DNA testing. And so
Yes.
Family Tree DNA only released their SNP Y-DNA testing. Don't quote me on this, but it might be like 6 years ago or something. So
Okay.
it's relatively recent versus STR data has been a lot more common for a while.
Okay. Okay, good. Hey, thank you for laying that foundation. Let me say some of that back to you, like in my own a lot dumber sounding way. And I'll use an example because so I had an autosomal test from Ancestry, and they, as their sample size grows bigger and bigger, they refine it. So you check your, I've got an app on my phone and I can check it, but that's why I did it, so I could see that ethnicity breakdown, right? And so what you were saying there was that it's when they say, hey, you're in this case, because most people listening to this want to know about their Scottish ancestry. So hey, you're 42% Scottish. Uh, That's not saying 42% of your ancestry comes from Scotland. It's saying 42% of your DNA looks like DNA that the people have in Scotland. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so,
Yeah.
so when I saw my results, they were not. So this is for my Welsh side. It had my most recent is in the 30s. 30 something percent, which that seems about right. My dad's side of the family settled a valley over here in southeast Idaho, which was predominantly Welsh. The name of the town's Malad, which means sick in French, but um, that had to do with French fur trappers, and nobody knew better to change the name. It's kind of a crazy name for a valley, but I love the valley, and it's where my roots are, and so bunch of Welshmen. So that part of it looked good, about what I thought it would be. But then the other ratios, like there should be, my English ratio should be huge, and it's not. My Scottish percent is higher than you would think looking at my family tree. So is the Scandinavian part of my family tree, or my DNA test. That says I have way more Scandinavian blood than my family tree represents. And so what I take, so I want to, this is why I want to bounce this off you, because I think a lot of the listeners who are like, oh, I'm 42% or 38 or 70, whatever percent this or that. What I'm gathering from that is I probably have a bunch of English ancestors who have very Scottish or Scandinavian looking DNA, but they're Englishmen. And they probably in real life would have, some of them might have been just, to know that their DNA looks Scottish, they probably would have killed them. They probably would have been upset to hear that. But, and it makes sense with the Viking input there that a lot of Englishmen and people all over the British Isles have Viking look or Scandinavian looking DNA. Viking's not a race. It was a job description. But is my thought process accurate on that?
Yeah. And so that's why I'm not a big, like when people get into the weeds about their percentages or try to make something of it, it's really hard. There's a reason they're called estimates. And so, especially in the British Isles, like of most of the studies that have come out on the British Isles, yes, you can distinguish or cluster people like based off of region and stuff, but they're so zoomed in when they're looking at that. And like by and large, like you talked about, I think your first couple episodes were on the origins of like large Scottish clans and whether they're, from the Gales or the Picts or, and so if you think about it, most both the English and Scottish have a Norman influence. Both the English and Scottish have a Scandinavian influence, whether it's the Danelaw in England,
Mhm.
or like the Vikings, kind of in Orkney, the Norwegians. So a lot of the populations who historically have contributed to Scotland and England are very similar. So I wouldn't, those percentages probably will change, and continue to change. Anecdotally, the Scotland percentage seems to be inflated right now, just based off of the tests that I'm in charge of. Um, People have higher Scottish in my family. People have higher Scottish percentages than they should, and the
Yeah.
Scandinavian tends to linger a little bit. And I think it is because, and what that's not necessarily saying is you have some long lost Swedish like great great grandfather. It's that, like you said, the your DNA today is similar to English people who are probably also similar to Scandinavian or Swedish
Mhm.
people, and it's all because of a history, whatever, a couple hundred years ago. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have recent ancestors. You might, the trap that people fall into is you could, if you look at it too religiously, you might start looking for ancestors that don't exist.
Gotcha. No, that's a really, I think that's really important for a lot of the listeners to hear because I do see this come up quite often. I mean, you've been on the Facebook group, and I mean, I think on the Facebook group, probably the majority of people on there have never listened to an episode ever once, even though that was what it was created for a kind of like a discussion forum for the podcast originally. But um, you see that a lot on there. Hey, DNA results said this, and I think your what you just explained helps them understand how not how seriously to take it, but what it's good for and what it's not good for. And I think you're going to get that into that a little bit more here in a second.
Yeah, I will. And before we jump to the next one, just the last thing, because this will tie in directly.
Please.
So what we're going to go into is, what is a haplogroup? Um, so I think the most succinct way, so you have a paternal, it comes down to, a haplogroup is a term used to describe or to group your Y DNA and your mitochondrial DNA. So it's only, you don't have an autosomal haplogroup, or like ancestry DNA is not going to tell you haplogroup. It's specific to, you have a paternal haplogroup, which is your Y DNA, and your maternal haplogroup, which is your mitochondrial DNA. And the most succinct way, we'll, as listeners will see, we're going to be focusing on Y DNA. So your paternal haplogroup, I would define it as a collection of men who have the same set of mutations on their Y chromosome. So mutations happen naturally, and they're actually very necessary and very useful to geneticists and genealogists, because that's how we group people together. So it's somewhat intuitive if you think about it, that two random English people are probably more closely related than an Englishman and a Frenchman, and the Englishman and the Frenchman are probably more closely related to each other than they are to someone from Italy, and going out, and all those
Sure.
Europeans are probably more closely related than they are to a Chinese person or something.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that's because the science of that, or the underlying genetics, is that through each generation, mutations naturally occur, from father to son in this case, in your Y chromosome. And so those mutations, the succession of those can be grouped together. So that's called a haplogroup. And so the ancestor of all men, scientists have dubbed Y chromosomal Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, if you're listening, and you're familiar with biblical stories, that's where the name Adam is coming from. But scientists don't necessarily mean it's referring to the same person. It's just the term for whoever they're considering the most recent common ancestor of all living men are today. And then haplogroups are named. So the oldest, or in the scientific jargon, is basal. The most basal haplogroup is A00, and then they branch off from each other. So then there's B, C, all the way down. So if you're just doing like a cursory look at haplogroups in Europe, you'll see R1b come up a lot. And so that is just a scientific designation for one of those descendants of Y chromosomal Adam. and the frequency of R1B just happens to be extremely high in Europe. Um, and so, last thing to get into on haplogroups before we move on is that there's two nomenclature systems, and it can get confusing. This tripped me up when I started doing research on this. The old nomenclature system is like a hierarchical system, so it'll be uh, letter number. So like I just said, like R1B, or if they're longer, like R1B, A2, C, whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and that at some point, scientists decided it would be more beneficial because as you find new mutations, that system could change this name of the same set of mutations, and it got really confusing because they'd
Mhm.
have to update them. So they decided that the easier way to do that would be to name them by the SNP mutation, to use the term that we were talking about.
Okay.
Um, the most recent SNP mutation became the name. So RM2, I believe it's RM269, um, is the most common haplogroup in Western Europe. And that M269 is the name of the SNP mutation uh, that culminates like in that string mutations. I don't know if that made sense. If
I
there's like
think
any
any of the
clarification.
listeners who have started poking around in this subject, I think they've seen some of these, especially if they get more lineage specific. I have seen this even in prepping for the talking about the Sinclairs recently. Um, I got into some of their genetic stuff, and they're like, "Yeah, this guy here had this," and I think he's talking about those smaller, more distinct that you're just describing, rather than just keep on
Yeah.
adding letters and numbers on the haplogroup.
So as an example, so R1B1 A1 A2, which is a mouthful, is
Hmm.
the same as RM269.
Okay.
And everyone today, you will only hear RM269 because if they find a new mutation at some point, and it's like, oh shoot, well now R1B1 is should actually be R1B2, but it refers to the same thing. It ends up being a mess.
Yeah,
And so you'll see more and more it's just the names of the SNPs.
I think we're all appreciative for things that make things simpler. Okay, cool. So thank you for laying the foundation. Um, what DNA is, different types of DNA, how those tests work, what they mean, what they don't mean. Let's push in a little bit into what can and can't DNA testing tell us, specifically why DNA. What can it and what can't it tell us about the Scottish clan system? Because I think well, even like something I saw recently. I'm 42% Scottish. What clan am I? And boom, they want to just take this and just connect them immediately.
Right. And so I think that specifically, I'll start actually with that example because I do think a lot of people come in with the percentages. Um, I Autosomal DNA testing, like Ancestry or something, just based off the percentages, can't really tell you anything about your relationship to the Scottish clan system. Because, I mean, Clint, like you talked about in earlier episodes, not every Scottish person has clan ancestors who were part of the clan system. And so just being simply Scottish isn't enough to have necessarily been a part of the clan system. And obviously, you've talked about the definition, like a kin-based society and the kindred groups. And so it's not necessarily restricted to the Highlands, but that being said, there's still, I don't know the percentage, but there's definitely a significant number of Scottish people who have no historical relation to the clan system. Um,
Yeah.
and so then, sorry, I didn't know if you wanted to.
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Um,
It's a hard subject because, pardon me, the purists want to be like, yeah, clans only. It's a Gallic word. It only existed with the Gaels. But then you run into problems with that because, like, then you're relegating to the Highlands. But then you have um, you have parts around like Inverness that started to become Scots speaking. So what's left over? Did they still have the clan system when those people? Like that's Highlands. It was Gaelic, then it wasn't, and then you got Galloway, not Galway, Ireland, but Galloway, Scotland, where that was a cultural extension of that Gal Gael. In fact, that's even where it comes from. That whole thing that we consider with the Hebrides and that fusion of Norse and Gaelic cultures and blood and all that stuff. That was it. Galloway was an extension of that. You can look on a map and it just circles right down nicely through there. And that was Gaelic speaking up until the somewhere into the 1600s, I think. And so that you when you're trying to box it up and make these tidy little divisions within Scotland, so I've argued that the clan or the kin-based society, even if it wasn't called clan, like it wasn't on the border, although the border had something very similar that a Highlander would have noticed a lot of similarities with, something that familiar. So I would argue that there were clans, to use a blanket term for that whole society, throughout Scotland, including the lowlands, while also maintaining that, like you were just hitting on, not every single, for some people, it was their borough that was more important to them than the bigger kin group or some other thing, some other identity that was stronger than that. And yeah, anyway, it's not tidy, I think is the point. So, and I think that leans into what you're saying. So continue on.
Yeah, yeah. And just as a like very quick anecdote, that's what I ended up finding out about my Dinning families that would be,
Mm.
from Kilmarnock, is that they weren't part of. There was no clan connection there. They just were Scottish. Um, and so that's why we're going to be focusing on Y DNA because, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the Scottish clan system is quite patriarchal, and so that leans very strongly into Y DNA testing. And there is a more meaningful discussion to be had about what Y-DNA testing can tell you about your connection to the clan system. But I think it is very important to qualify what it can and can't tell you. So a lot of clans, Clan Donald is the one who's pioneered this, kind of followed by Clan Gregor with using DNA testing. Um, and so they've identified, and now many clans have followed suit. They've tested either the clan chief or relatives of the clan chief. And through SNP testing, like we mentioned earlier, they've determined what the marker is for the chiefly line of the clan. And it's very important to highlight that it's the chiefly line. Um, and as you've talked about, Clint, again in other episodes, clan was a lot bigger than just the people who were related to the chief. And so one thing that you have to be careful about is that when you take a test, I would say a Y-DNA test is the results can be sufficient, but not necessary to prove a connection to a Scottish clan. And so what I mean by that is if you take a Y-DNA test or you have a male relative take a Y-DNA test and they match the chiefly signature, I think it is pretty clear, and you have that surname of the chief, I think it's pretty clear to say that your ancestors were a part of that Scottish clan, however many hundred years back. However, if you have a Scottish clan surname and you take a Y-DNA test and your Y-DNA does not match the chiefly line of the clan that your surname's a part of, that's where it gets a little murky. I don't know that you can definitively say that your family was not a part of that Scottish clan. And I think that's kind of where some traditional genealogical work comes in, and it ends up becoming a probability or probabilistic to a certain extent. And you just have to decide what you're comfortable with deciding at what point where your ancestors are part of the clan. Um, there are records that exist, like I think you mentioned, Clint, where you could say these people lived in this clan's property or household, and so you could maybe infer that they were part of the clan. But Y-DNA testing specifically, if you don't match the chiefly line, does not automatically mean that you're not part of that Scottish clan. It just requires some more effort.
Absolutely. And not all, you hit on this, not all people within the clan, even though they bore the surname, they may or may not be actually blood related to the chief. That's important, I think. And this is something that Neil King, he's quite active on the Facebook group, and I value, and some people get all wound up and they get their Oh, there's a lot of vulgar terms I could use for that, but they get offended, I guess, is the short way of saying that, because he'll throw things like that out there, like, because that there's the DNA, there's the surname, which are, like you were saying, they're leads, and then also it's hard to, you can't replace just actually doing some genealogy, and sometimes that's hard because sometimes the records weren't well kept, and in some areas they were kept better than in others, and you can only find it back to a certain place, and then you're like, I've got McCormick ancestors that were from Fife. That's not McCormick's not a Fife name. My assumptions they came from somewhere else, but I can't get it any farther back than those in Fife. I don't know if they're a sept of the McLeans or the Buchanans, but that genealogy work, that you can't just shrug your shoulder and say, well, I got a DNA test and I have this last name. But if you can trace, if you're, what's a name? Well, let's go back to your Wilson example. I think that with the Wilsons, I've got a lot of mileage out of the Wilsons because it's a very common Scottish last name, isn't it?
Yeah,
And
extremely common.
yeah, and there was a bunch of sons of Will who had no connection to the guns. A lot of them. But if you could double it up with a DNA test, that hey, our DNA kind of looks like that. Also, we can trace ancestry up to Caithness or Sutherland, somewhere up in the region of Scotland where the guns held sway. Now we're really putting it all together. What do you think?
Yeah, and even Wilson's a common example. And I commented at one point, I think on one of the posts about my own Wilson uh, journey, that my Wilson, I have Wilsons too. I mentioned it at the beginning on my dad's side, and they're from the Scottish English border, which is not close to Caithness. And but my family has I don't know how old the tradition is, but my dad and his third cousin, so relatively old, were both told that we were descended from Clan Gun. And I had my cousin who is a male Wilson, still has the surname. I had him take a DNA test, and there is no connection to the Guns. Um, and
Fascinating.
so, yeah, and I think that's popular. I mean, I'm sure that's pretty common with the name Wilson, but something to also caution against the DNA test is that, I mean, even Mac in Gaelic just means son. And so if you're a Mackenzie or a Mackay, like that doesn't necessarily, there were many of Kenneths and I's running around in Scotland. And so it's hard to say. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there actually are a couple examples. I think Mackay, maybe you could correct me, but there's like two independent Mackay families that aren't related, and they both in Scotland, and they just happen to be two, eyes from whatever hundreds of years ago.
No, that's a really good one to illustrate that point. I think there's more than two. There's several completely unrelated. Um, Donaldson, Duncan, these were ubiquitous in Scotland. And so your last name's Duncan. You're like, well, clearly we were from the Struans, like the Robertsons of Struan and up in that group. Maybe you were, maybe not. Do some genealogy, take a DNA test, double up. But I think too many people are getting their information from a jewelry website or some other place where there's a clan list, or like I went to a couple of Scottish festivals last summer, and sure enough, large as life, they'll have a sign put up and it says, hey, here's all our,
Yeah.
this clan will say, here's all our septs. Well, yeah, that it's probably not inaccurate. There's probably were people who were tailors I know there were tailors who were connected to the Camerons. But to your Wilson example, but yeah, Mackay's, McNeil, Matheson, Morrison, and those are all names that have an actual clan, and then a bunch of other people who were not connected.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so let's get into, like, as we're already starting to lean in our conversation towards specific surnames. Are you ready to go to that?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. So there's things you can tell, things you can't tell from a DNA test. Was there anything else that you wanted to hit on before we transition?
I think that was good actually.
Okay.
If you have any questions, but I think that was it for me.
No, okay, good. All right. I just want to make sure I wasn't leaving anything behind. Because for the we're just talking, guys. And we're if you're listening to this, we're not under a time constraint. Um, there's probably somewhere in here I'll have to give a shout out to my sponsor, but I might insert it. I don't know how I'm gonna do that. We'll figure it out. Okay. The next thing on our little list of things to talk about was specific clans. Does Y-DNA confirm or refute tradition? This was the part of the outline you gave me where it's like I cannot wait to talk about this. So go on down the line there. We're gonna start with Clan Sorla or Sorley.
Yeah, so starting with them, that refers to Summerled or Sorley's the Gallic pronunciation and spelling. Um, so that refers to the McDonalds, the McDougals, and the McAllisters. And so this was something that was really interesting to me and surprising, actually. Summerled, I think, lived about in the 11th century, I think around there. And so Brian Sykes, who passed away a couple of years ago, actually in 2020, but was emeritus professor of human genetics at the University of Oxford, wrote an article called The Genetic Structure of the Highland Clan. And it's available on the internet. I think it's through Electric Scotland, which you've talked about. And I dug for a long time trying to find the date of this paper that he wrote. And even like in books that he's written, I could not find it. I'm pretty sure it's early 2000s though. And what he did is he sent a swab. This is earlier before testing was as easy, which is why I think it's the early 2000s. But he sent DNA sample collection kits to, I believe, four or five. I think it's five chiefs from Clan Sorley, and so four from the McDonalds. So I think it's Lord McDonald, McDonald's of Slate, and two others. I can check, but and then McAllister of Loop. I don't know Loup.
That's how I've always said it, but
And
I've been corrected numerous
okay.
times by Scottish listeners.
And what they ended up finding is that all five of those carried the same genetic signature, which is, and they've actually since identified the Clan Donald has identified what they believe to be the mutation that arose in Summerled or his near ancestors. So I'll say the names as we talk, just if people are curious and they end up doing research. So it's R. It starts with the letter R, and then the mutation is YP326. So it's R hyphen YP326. Is believed to have originated about 1100 AD, and it's what Clan Donald has posited as being from Summerled. And Brian Sykes notes in his article that this is pretty amazing feat because the total number of father to son transmissions in the genealogy between the five chiefs is 87. And we were talking about the non-paternity rate a little earlier. So Brian Sykes calculated it to be about 1.3% per generation, which is actually not insignificant.
Huh.
And so I did the math. I'm hoping I did this right, but if I just did 1.3 to the x, because you just be multiplying 1.3 by itself for the generations. And so if you once you 1.3 to the 17.5, which so would be about 17 and a half generations, you reach 100%. So statistically, they're saying it's guaranteed. Doesn't mean it always happens, but on average, statistically, you're guaranteed to have a non-paternity event within 17 and a half generations. And so, but here there's an example with Summerled. They're 87, and their genealogies ended up being accurate. And so the tradition of the McDougals, McDonalds, and McAllisters being descended from Summerled seems to hold up under genetic scrutiny.
That is fascinating. So yeah, Summerled was in the 1100s. I think he died in 1164 at the Battle of Renfrew, which he was leading an invading force. That's crazy that there's that many generations of a non-paternal or paternity event. That's wild. Also, we might throw in there the McRorys. I think the McAllisters were an early, and I read that paper, and they were one of the surname groups. McAllisters were an early branch, one of the older branches of McDonald's. You have some of those branches that took different names, like McAllister did and McKeon of Ardnamurchan. And then the McRorys were another kindred, but they kind of evaporated during the 1300s. Well,
Yeah, patrilineally, I don't know if any, because if they did exist, they would have been. I mean, I think there's the is it John of Isla, one of the McDonald
yep,
chiefs married the Amy McRory, I think is her
yep,
name, the heiress of the McRorys,
yep,
and so if a male or I'm sure statistically there probably are some male McRorys today that are descended patrilineally from the Somerled McRorys, but they must have been pretty distant because you would think in historical record someone would have popped up to contest the McDonald's uh, takeover of the McRory claim.
yeah. The McDonald's of Clan Ranald became, it's almost like a rebranded McRory clan. Not that might be doing injustice to the McDonald's of Clan Ranald, but by that I mean they inherited that Anya McRory's. They're the sons of John of Isla and Anya McRory. Their inheritance largely followed that very substantial, very large McRory inheritance, and that became kind of Clan Ranald territory. And so, and I'm sure a lot of the people who had been adhering and identified with McRory were now Clan Ranald. So yeah, so in that way they're kind of rebranded Clan McRory. But to your point, the surname didn't really continue. I mean, maybe there exists, but you don't have this in later generations, this big Clan McRory in the way that you did, especially the McDonald's. So yeah, for the DNA testing for that, McAllister, McDonald, McDougal.
Now,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say now one interesting thing is what we can also learn now is now that we're confident of what Summerled's DNA or why DNA looks like, we can also say something about his ancestry. And then this is where it's interesting about sometimes tradition isn't wholly confirmed or refuted. And so in this case, those clans today, their descent from Summerled is confirmed. However, Summerled's genealogy, if you look traditionally, is supposed to be descended from Clan Calla, which is an Irish kin group. And Summerled, and there's been huge debates about whether the name Sorley is originally Gallic or Norse, and whether it's a like natively Gallic or whether it's a Norse name was introduced in Gallic or vice versa. And so people try to make a big fuss out of determining his ethnicity and validating the genealogy just based off his name. But now we have genetics, which is really interesting. And so there's a big Clan Calla DNA Y-DNA project, and the researchers over there believe that they've determined Clan Calla's Y-DNA signature. And Summerled is very distinctly Norse and not related to Clan Calla, which is very interesting and I'm sure surprising to some. But I think if you think about it based off of where Summerled was from, I think having a Norse patriline, and now this is something to get into when we talk about what can and can't Y-DNA tell us, though. Could Summerled be descended non-patrilineally, which means from any other part of his family line other than his father's father's father? Could he be descended from Clan Calla in another way? Maybe. But the genealogy that's presented is patrilineal. And as far as his Y-DNA is concerned, his male ancestors are Norse and not Irish.
That is really interesting. And yeah, I saw that in there, and that's gonna, like you said, there's some emotional connections. In fact, I was watching Neil Oliver, The Face of Britain, and he was. Have you seen that?
I haven't, but I've heard of it.
I think I watched it on YouTube. I think it's right on there, unless they decided they were losing money and took it off. But he went all around Britain, and they're doing like look at like facial recognition software and kind of DNA and doing all that kind of stuff. But they were up in the Northern Isles, up in Orkney and Shetland, where it seemed like, just from what I saw on that program specifically, the average person there kind of just considers themselves Norse. And turns out that there were more of that original population that survived than there's a bigger genetic signature that rose up. And they still had substantial Norse elements to the genetic makeup of the Northern Isles, but there is a lot more. I don't know if it was Pictish. I've read an article by Alex Wolf who maybe wants to pump the brakes on assuming that that Pictish language, what was spoken up there, and it's he said he wasn't saying that it was Gallic, but there's a really good chance that the whatever Celtic language was spoken in the Northern Isles before the Vikings showed up had more in common, had more similar features to the Q Celtic side of the family than it did to the P Celtic, which would be the Pict is what part the Pictish language is on. It's on the P Celtic side, but yeah, so that was a really yeah. Okay, so
I would,
go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say one more thing that gets confusing though is that there are McDonald's who, just in general, McDonald's today who match Clan Kala. And
Oh.
so initially it became confusing whether that was the chiefly line and that
Oh.
they were actually descended from Somerled, or whether the other McDonald's are it became a big question whether Somerled himself was this Norse side that all these McDonald's had, or whether he was part of Clan Kala, which all these McDonald's had. And uh, a lot of the McDonald's who are part of Clan Kala all descend from a McDonald who is supposed to be distantly descended from Somerled. And so the conclusion that I kind of came to is like we were talking about, there's probably it was an Irish McDonald, which is where Clan Kala is. And so the conclusion that I kind of came to reading that is that there's probably a non-paternity event in Ireland of a descendant of Somerled.
Hmm.
And so if you look at the genealogy, it says that these McDonald are descended from Somerled, but realistically, some male in Ireland fathered a McDonald, and that it just became muddied because that male happened to be descended from Clan Kala, so it muddied the results. But it just goes to show you that it's really not clear cut, and you kind of have to do your due diligence when you're looking at the Y-DNA signatures in the history.
That's really interesting. Going back to that YouTube video I was watching yesterday during that workout, one thing that the gentleman, I wish I had his name so I could give him credit, but um, one thing he mentioned was that I like that non-paternity event because I mean sometimes it was an affair and sometimes it was a foster child that never went back to his own family. Father was killed and raised in another family. Sometimes it was like in those situations where you're he used the example of Cromwell. Cromwell's last name, Oliver Cromwell's last name wasn't Cromwell, it was Williams, and he married into a more important, prestigious family, and so he went with that one. And he said there's examples of that happening with the Butlers in Ireland. It was I think the genetic signature was more close to like an O'Brien, but yeah, clearly it wasn't one of the ruling O'Brien families, but somebody farther down the line who wasn't from a super prestigious, but married a butler, and they were crazy powerful. And anyway, switch names. So there's all sorts of reasons aside from affairs, and there were affairs, and we're not going to judge because I liked the fact that I got to pick my wife. and, and that somebody else wasn't making that decision for me. So I'm not going to hold it against anybody. Just, I'm not trying to advocate for adultery, but just non-paternal events, non-paternity events. I like that term and that it's kind of opens up. I just want to maybe paint a bunch of scenarios where we could call it a non-paternity event. Yeah. So Clan Sorley, Donald, what else to keep on going, Ethan? Keep on teaching us
Yeah.
about
So the
this.
next one we talked about was Shiel Alpin, and this one, because I know you did an episode too on Shiel Alpin. Actually, when I listened to that, by the way, is my pronunciation? I think I remember that from your episode.
Well, I
Shiel
always
Alpin.
invite Gallic speakers to correct me, but I've always said Shiel because there's an accent mark over that I. Shiel
Right.
Alpin. That's as close as I got. You're doing fine. I
Okay. Um, and this one is probably the most I, like maybe explosive. That might be a strong word, but I really can't find like any evidence genetically to that any of those kin groups are related, which is pretty crazy to me. And if you look in, posted about this a little bit, and this is that paper I sent you about the descendants of Cormac MacAbertach,
Yeah.
which seemed to kind of be the precursor to the concept of Shiel Alpin. Um, Even then, it's really hard. There's not genetic evidence for all of the clans, and actually some of the sources I'll go into, the two clans that are likely, or as far as looking at the literature, are the most likely to be actually descended from Cormac MacAbertach. Their genetic, they haven't, their clans haven't identified the chiefly line yet, so there's still like the verdict's still out completely. But most of my information on this comes from David Seller. And so he was Lord Lyon from 2008 to 2014. And he also passed away a couple of years ago in 2019. But I actually have the book. I can't see it on the screen. But they, the Inverness Field Club published a collection of lectures from, I think this is published in the 80s, from a bunch of people who are well known in the, or well versed in the Scottish clans. And so David Seller, you'll see a lot on him, but he wrote a chapter called Highland Family Origins, Pedigree Making and Pedigree Faking. And it's really interesting. And he really goes into the descendants of Cormac MacAbertach. Um, I guess I'll cover this one's a bit behemoth kind of like information. So I'll backtrack a little on the Shiel Alpin side because that's the one people are more familiar with. So you might have to help me out, but I think is it six clans that are associated with Shiel Alpin? It's McGregor, McNabb, Grant, McKinnon, um, McPhee. I think I'm doing pretty well actually.
Yeah.
There's I think there's one more, but um,
I'm looking it up
yeah,
right
tell
now.
me. Let me know if that's right. But and
Okay.
there's typically a tree on Wikipedia.
Yeah, there is exactly what I'm looking at on Wikipedia, the source of all truth. Clan Gr- Clan Grant, Clan Gregor, Clan Macaulay, Clan McPhee, Clan
Oh, that's right.
McKinnon, Clan McNabb, Clan McQuarrie.
Okay. So the historical tradition, as far as I can find, for Shiel Alpin, a lot of the times comes from the bonds of Manrent, which you've also touched on in your podcast.
Like the
But
1500s.
even yeah, which is
Yeah.
pretty late
Yeah.
considering when Alpin is supposed to have lived, which is I think the 800s, like the ninth century. Um,
Yep.
and one thing which is kind of the theme of David Seller's article is that, which is something we don't think about, but uh, the term kin-based society, he doesn't say this part specifically, but the kin-based society implies that kinship was really important. But kinship, it didn't necessarily matter that it was true. It was a
Mhm.
political tool. And typically the Shanachies were sent to Ireland to learn about the art of storytelling and genealogy. And so they're well versed in Irish royal genealogy. And so, for example, like with Somerled, it's very possible that that was fabricated because everyone in the population in the Shanachies at the time uh, were well versed in Irish genealogy, and so a later MacDonald said, "I to validate their claim to the throne, wanted to orchestrate a genealogy the uh, from the Irish royal family or one of the Irish royal families." And so similarly here, that kind of seems to be the case. There isn't, I mean, even historically beyond the bonds of Manrent, it's pretty tenuous, the connections between the clans. And a lot of these clans actually earlier, so there's a manuscript from 1467
Yeah.
um, that is considered one of the kind of premier Gallic genealogies.
That's a
Most of,
big deal.
I think, of those clans you said, Grant and Macaulay are the only ones I think that are not on. Yeah, that Grant and Macaulay are the only ones that are not on this list. All of those Shiel Alpin clans claim descent in that 1467 manuscript from Cormac MacAbertach. So to me that says a lot that now obviously you have to evaluate that manuscript and whether those genealogies are true or not, but um, that seems pretty interesting to me. And so this article specifically, I can kind of hone in on three of them, but David Siller has a lot to say about Clan Gregor and their ancestry. And so the Gregory that is put or purported to be, normally it's either like Kenneth MacAlpin's nephew or brother. Um, David Seller says there's absolutely no evidence for the existence of a Gregory. And the whole concept of Gregory the Great or the King, I think he's called the King of the Scots or something like that. There's no historical evidence
It's not on
for
any of the
that.
king lists.
No,
Nothing.
uh, and and the Gregory that, or sorry, the Gregor of the Golden Bridles, I think is what you talk about from the 1300s or 1400s,
Yeah.
is likely the namesake of the actual namesake of Clan McGregor or Clan Gregor. Um, and he even goes into Clan Gregor's descent or purported descent from Cormac MacAbertach, and he says that it equally doesn't really hold weight, and that the oldest genealogies or the most authentic genealogies, how he defines it and evaluates in the article, point to descent from the abbots of Glendocart, I think is the way you say it. Um, and so, interestingly, MacNab, who's also considered a Shiel Alpin
Hmm.
uh, clan, also has a tradition of descent from the abbots of Glendocart. And so there's some speculation about those two clans in particular might actually be related. And I actually didn't have this at the time on the PDF I sent you, but MacNab actually has identified the chiefly line. So there is genetic data. And McGregor and MacNab are not related genetically either within a
Oh,
meaningful time frame. So that one was really interesting to me, which was kind of the two clans that I thought would most likely, regardless of the genealogies, probably be related.
yeah.
Um, but the interesting thing, so of all the clans that he mentions that are likely to be descended from Cormac MacAbertach is uh, McKinnon and Macquarie, because when you look at the genealogies, or the number of people in between the progenitors of the clans and Cormac MacAbertach, McKinnon and Macquarie are the most consistent,
Hmm.
have the same number of generations roughly. Um, and I think, I don't know, there's actually an interesting story that he begins with at the very beginning of the chapter. If you're interested in hearing about that, I can just
You're
read
ready with it.
like
Let's do it.
I am, yeah. Okay, so this comes from the history of the McDonalds, which it says is attributed to Hugh MacDonald. And I did some research. And the history of MacDonald was written in the mid 1600s. But the story comes from the 15th century. And it says, I'll skip a little bit, but the story is of a great feast given by the Lord of the Isles at his castle at Aros in Mull, Aros. And so he talks about that, goes through, there's an introduction. And then I'll start here. It says this family, which is talking about the McDonald's. So he says, they're all sitting down for dinner. This family indeed might claim to be lords since King David Bruce's time, but the old Scots were careless of their prerogatives. Then he desired McFinnan and Macquarie to sit, which he annotates as McKinnon and Macquarie. For Macquarie was an ancient thane. Then he desired Beaton, the principal physician, then McMurch, the poet, to take their seats. Now, saith he, I'm the oldest and best of your surnames here present, and will sit down. As for these fellows who have raised up their heads of late and are upstarts, whose pedigrees we know not, nor even themselves, let them sit as they please. MacLean, MacLeod of Harris, and McNeil of Barra went out in a rage, and were very much discontented. And it goes on talking about that. But it's interesting that he calls out a story from the 15th century, the 1400s, that McFinnan, or I guess McKinnon and Macquarie at the time, he calls out specifically Macquarie as an ancient thane. But obviously at that time, there was some sense that they were connected to the Gallic aristocracy. And so that, in conjunction with the fact that their genealogies kind of line up for being descendants of Cormac MacAbertach, he concludes that it's likely that those two are indeed descended from Cormac MacAbertach. But again, there's no genetic info on that specifically, but the available genetic info on those surnames shows no correlation between any of them.
So, quick question for you. Have they discovered a genetic signature that indicates that ancient MacAlpin line? I would imagine, Just okay, so
Sorry, my
go.
gear. I'm smiling. Nobody can tell on the podcast, but I'm smiling because I had that light bulb go off too of like, wow, well, what if there was living descendants today of the McAlpins, which is something that I've actually
Uh-huh.
been is an ongoing project of mine research wise. And I didn't say it in the beginning, but I'm also a project co-administrator for the Canal Owen Y-DNA project, which they're part of the O'Neill or like O'Neill
Oh, yeah.
family. Yeah. And so it was kind of a side. It starts to get a little related, and I'll get into that later. But I had that thought. I did a lot of research, and it's really unclear. So the McDuff's is the best, which you've talked about before, is the best historical example of having a patrilineal connection to the House of Alpin. But the problem is that the McDuff's today, it's really unclear, and there's certain surnames that are associated it with, like Wemyss, I think, and
Weems.
even all of yeah,
Yeah.
um, claim descent from the Earls of Fife, and that's where it gets it's really murky, and the genetic data is absent, but even the historical claim to being descended from the the Macduff Earls of Fife is is really rocky. But I'm really curious because it could be it's nobody's saying that it's not true. It's just that it's unlikely to be true, but there's no genetic data.
Yeah.
But it's an ongoing, it's unknown.
Yeah. So in John Bannerman and his that I've cited it a billion times on the podcast, but he writes a whole chunk of that. One of those works that's part of the collected works is on the Macduff Earls of Fife, and there is, contrary to the whole thing that you said about Gregor and the McGregors coming from and they can never find that Duve or Dove or something, like some similar pronunciation to that, was an actual MacAlpin king. And his argument was that maybe they were given the premier earldom, which was Fife, as like this big gem to get them off the backs and not make sure they don't contend for the actual throne with this other line, because they had a fairly decent claim to the throne. And so here you go. But like when you say that, if there's no, because that would implicate, there'd be implications for, like you said, the Weems or Wemyss, I think is Weems, but they're
Yeah,
like
I'm
the
not sure the
scrim.
pronunciation.
Yeah, somebody can get on there and straighten us out. But Scrimgeour, and once again I might have been butchering that one, but they're another one that claim connection to the Macduff Earls of Fife. But then if you look at the traditional Macintosh
Yeah,
origin
that too.
tales, yep. And then there's a bunch that spin off the Macintoshes, like the Farquharsons and the McThomases and the Shaws, Highland Shaws. There's other lowland ones. So there's like this ripple effect throughout these if that's true or not true about the Macduffs, then all these other clans who claim connection to this house. I did read something once where like it said that the whole marriage of the early Macintosh chief to Eva,
Yeah,
and thus his
Angus or
in
something.
the Clan Catton connection, Chatton, I don't know, but that connection there is, that's almost like a archetype. And
Yeah,
that,
it's a little
yeah, like there's a bunch of Evas throughout different origin stories in the Highlands, and that this is or I don't know if a trope would be the, anyway, that the
kind of.
Macintoshes would be how do they explain having they had to explain how they become dominant within Clan Catton. They may have, I can't remember what I was reading, and I owe it to the listeners to find this, but they may have been a junior to the McPhersons, but that actually came into power, because sometimes that happened. The junior line becomes the most dominant and powerful. The McDonalds are a great example of that. So how do the Macintoshes explain it? Well, we're descended from the Earls of Fife and the Macduffs, and it goes way back and super powerful, and we married the heiress. But then you're like, that raises more questions, like, well, how come it went through a female line when you had very legitimate male line connections in the old Clan Catton? Anyway, the
Yeah, and I did his name. I'm gonna. It's I think it's Ranald Black has done a lot of research on MS 1467, which includes a lot of genealogies. We touched on that briefly earlier. Um, and so the Macintoshes are included in that. And he's of the opinion, which I believe William Forbes Skeen, again, I think that's how you say the last name, um, was he flips his opinion. That's a side note, but he changes his opinion like later on in life about certain of the clans that he writes about in the 1800s. Uh, but they're of the opinion that so the Macintosh is supposed to be descended from Shaw Macduff is the name. And right when I read that immediately, that just sounds a little too perfect. That's just anecdotal, but it's like, oh, like Shaw Macduff is plucked in and like it perfectly matches the surname and all this stuff. But Ronald Black and William Skeen are of the opinion that the Macintoshes and the McPhersons are both patrilineally descended from Gillihatmore, and that there is no Macduff connection. And there isn't enough genetic data on that yet, but that's actually something I'm really interested in doing research on later. That's why it wasn't included as one of the kin groups to discuss for the podcast. But there's a plethora of available. I looked because I was curious, and there's because the other problem you run into is that certain chiefs today are not patrilineally descended, like the Mackenzies.
Hmm.
And Farquharson, actually, Farquharson is not the Farquharson chief has the Farquharson last name, but is not. I think it's his great grandmother or something who's at actual Farquharson.
Okay.
But there is a Macintosh chief, a McThomas chief. Um, I think there's a Shaw chief, and I believe and then on the other side there's a McPherson chief. So the people exist to test the theory of whether the McPhersons and Macintosh kin group are patrilineally related. It just hasn't, to my knowledge, it hasn't been done yet.
Maybe you're the guy, Ethan.
I would love to be. I'm very interested. If anyone's listening with Clanhatton Association connections, feel free to reach out. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, that'd be pretty
We
cool.
got derailed a little bit. Sorry. Um,
You know what?
I
I
can.
mean, we're right on target. We're talking about genetic studies and specific clans and kindreds and lines and stuff. I think we're still right on target. I think there's room in this subject for exploration a little bit. We don't want to make it too rigid. Where do you want to go next?
We can just keep moving on with the McNeils.
Yeah.
And so McNeil is one of those surnames people associate with the O'Neill kindred, and it seems intuitive when you hear it. The surname means son of Neil, and there's this O'Neill kindred from Ireland. And you've talked about how Anrahan is supposed to be this prince descended from the O'Neills, and a lot of Scottish clans claim descent from Anrahan. And I also looked to try to find if I could holistically find enough information on the descendants of Anrahan, and it's not quite there yet, but there is enough on the McNeils to talk about. And I think they're the most prominent or most well known just in lay persons in that community about the descendants of Anrahan. So anyway, the McNeils, or interestingly, the O'Neill genetic signature has been identified. So of the Irish clan. And so that was something that was really big 10, 15 years ago, maybe even later than that. And identified, if you've heard, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Was it the Neil of the Nine Hostages
Yeah.
line? Like they can go clear back that far.
Yeah. So they identified a genetic signature that they believe was uh, arose in him or one of his immediate ancestors. And so that was termed RM222. And so uh, you'll see that all over the internet, but the data on that is a little outdated if you're just searching Google and stuff for genetic or generic stuff on the O'Neills. When they started dating SNPs, they found that RM222 comes from about 140 BC, which is way too early to have arisen in Nile of the Nine Hostages. So it probably arose in one of his ancestors, but not in him. So if
Okay.
you test and you're RM222 positive, it's not automatically indicative of being descended from Nile of the Nine Hostages. Um, which if you read a lot, if you read articles today, even it'll still say that that signature is associated with him. Um, the signature today that is assumed to be from Now the Nine Hostages is the descendant of RM222 called DF105. And again, the reason I'm including these SNP names is that if you end up testing and you're curious, or you have tested and you're wondering how it fits in, and you hear this, then you can, maybe learn a little bit more about where your patch line comes from. But anyway, the point of that serves as a background that the O'Neill family is well attested and documented. So it's possible for then the McNeils to test and see if they match. And again, this one was actually extremely conclusive. And there are some articles on Herald Scotland about this from 2015 that there is definitely no connection between the McNeils and the O'Neills. And even in the article, this ruffled some feathers. They interviewed some McNeils from the Highlands, and some people were just like pretty okay with it, and other people were a little upset by the disruption of the tradition. But again, I think it's really interesting that it kind of makes sense based off where the McNeils and the McDonalds are from the same general area. And so I think it's very interesting to note that two clans who both claimed Royal Irish ancestry are in fact Norse in an area that was overwhelmingly Norse historically. So I think this is another example where it's probably the genealogy at some point was inserted to inflate the pedigree of the chiefs.
Yeah. It, that part of Scotland's way interesting. We were mentioning in the beginning the Galgale, that this fusion, this really cool fusion of the Gaelic language and culture and people with the Scandinavian settlers in that area. You're right, though. The historical context does lend itself to some Scandinavian lineages. It's just interesting that they ended up becoming so Gallicized, which the Vikings were good at going native wherever they settled, right? But they yeah, good, great, interesting stuff, Ethan. So
And
interesting.
I think one other interesting thing too to wrap back to the David Seller article with that anecdote from History of McDonald's is if you're listening carefully, you heard that the McNeils of Barra was one of the clans that the McDonald chief said were upstarts and had no pedigree. And so you'd think that at the time, if they were actually descended from the Royal Irish dynasty, that somebody would have probably known that or said something or made some comment. Um, so it kind of lines up with that story as well. And one other interesting thing is that there's two prominent branches: the McNeils of Bar and the McNeils of Gia.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of tropes I think in Gallic genealogy. You said with the marrying an heiress
Yeah.
and inheriting land, and another one is like a pair of brothers or a couple brothers. And the McNeil one is very much that two brothers gave rise to, one was the McNeils of Bar and one was the McNeils of Gia. And you always have to be kind of careful or suspicious, I'd say.
Mhm.
And so the McNeil, Clan McNeil, their DNA project found that the Bar McNeils and the Gia McNeils are not genetically related on the
Oh,
patch line.
really? I think I think Wikipedia's going to have to adjust their article.
Which is actually something broader, which is really interesting to me. So a lot of this data is publicly available, but I don't think the right people are connected. A lot
Yeah.
of this information is on family tree DNA projects that are run by the clan societies themselves. So a lot of
Yeah.
this research is well known to the clan associations, um, but they don't publish their findings very often. And when they update it, they don't publish it either. So there's actually a lot of information. All of this information that I've found and I've learned is publicly available on the internet. You just kind of have to know. more familiar with family tree DNA and the way the surname projects work. And so I've been able to learn kind of how to navigate that interface and find the right information. But you're right. If you check Wikipedia on some of this stuff, it's really outdated, and
Mhm.
it's interesting to see that. But for to not to blame the people who are running the Wikipedia pages, it's not obvious. I think the clan associations could do a better job of publicizing the results that they find.
Absolutely. In fact, that you're touching on something that is at the foundation of what I'm trying to do with this podcast. Because when I was forced to dig to produce the kind of content that flies at a master's level for a thesis, um, I was forced to do it. But what I found is just exactly what you're saying right there, Ethan, is that there's stuff out there that nobody finds because it's not the first thing that pops up at the top of a Google search. And trying to connect. And that's why I love having you with me today, and this conversation we're having is because we're getting to connect people with information that, yes, it's out there, but it's not well placed, like you were saying. Another thing that I think is an obstacle to a lot of people who are interested but lack the bandwidth to just dive into this as hardcore is that when they do find it, it's not easily digestible because you're studying this on a collegiate level. You speak the language way better than I do. And you can read an academic paper on this and just go, okay, it's talking about this, this, and this, and this. I found that, like, in some of the sources I found, this academia, it's um, it's dry. because it's not because they're not capable writers. It's because of what the purpose of their writing, who's their audience. It's mostly other scholars, and if their stuff isn't wired so tight, every argument, assertion, claim, and that's how they have to write it. Boom, here's what I'm saying. Boom, 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 and this is why. And normal people don't think like that. They like, just give me some stuff. It's okay. You're somebody who knows more. I know less. Just teach me. And it's not written like that. More journalists who have written history works, you'll find they write a lot better for an average person to listen to. But the scholarship is not quite to the standard that the academics are doing. But so it's out there, but it's hard to find. And when they do find it, it's sometimes hard to read. All those are problems. But I'm glad that you're here breaking it down for people. Keep going, Ethan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. So the next one I was talking about is Clan Donaghy, or the Robertsons and the Dunbars. And so some of this research is my own, actually. And then some of this research is from the University of Strathclyde. So they have a really cool genealogy program. They're one of the only universities I've seen that offers master's and graduate programs in genealogy. There's like heraldic studies and other focuses that they have. But they have a lot of really good information, scholarly. It's kind of it's a little more digestible than the uh, family tree DNA results pages and groups. You just have to dig a little bit on the Strathclyde website. But they did a study on the Dunbars because they were researching the descendants. They have two projects, two main ones, on the Battle of Bannockburn and then the Declaration of Arbroath. Um, and so they were researching the Dunbars, and anyway, they identified some descendants of the Dunbars, and the significance of the Dunbars and Clan Donaghy are that both have traditions of descent from Crenan, who's the abbot of Dunkeld, and whose son is supposed to have been Duncan, or is Duncan the First, who was king of Scotland. And so this was an example where there's two possible clans that could be descended from Scottish royalty, before the Stuarts, which is why I think it's really interesting. And the Dunbars claim is actually really interesting because, strictly speaking, the Dunbars are supposed to have been descended from Crenan the Thane, And there's a lot of scholarly debate about whether Crinan the Thane and Crinan Abbot of Dunkeld are the same person. And the consensus now seems to be no. So the
Really?
Dunbars are not, yeah, and that one's actually not genetics related. You can look up. They actually did. There's a conference available online of Alistair McDonald, who's with the University of Strathclyde, talking about some of their findings.
And this is just
Um,
when you say it's
and
online, like give us a little more detail. Because I know there's some people, myself included, who are like, where online? Where?
yeah, yeah. I'll have to find the YouTube video, but I think if you look up, I can't remember which project, but it's either the Battle of Bannockburn or the Declaration of Arbroath. Alistair McDonald did a talk for it was a heritage center or society in England. I'll find the link afterwards and I can send it to you. But he
And I'll
gave
include it in the notes.
yeah, and he gave a presentation. It's not just on the Dunbars, but he includes the Dunbars. And so he just not genetics related found that the Dunbars likely are not this are descended from a Crinan, but not the Crinan, who's considered the progenitor of what's called now the House of Dunkeld. I've read like some people get picky about that. Technically, it's not really a house or whatever, but for it's simplistic and it works, so I'll
Like
use
the
it
word
here.
clan.
Yeah. Because yeah, I won't digress in that,
Yep, we'll leave it alone.
um, but so interestingly, just to touch on the Dunbar signature is known. It's what's referred to as RZP33. And so one of the interesting things is that is descended from, you'll kind of learn if you do more research into this. We kind of just stay focused on the clans, but there's a couple overarching haplogroups that are known, are associated with certain cultures. So like I said, RM269 is generally considered Northwestern European or just Western European in general. So ZP33 is descended from RU106, which is one of the many descendants of RM269. But RU106 is generally associated with the Germanic peoples. And so what that's implying is that the Dunbars are descended from a Germanic people. Now it's hard to say, is it Anglo-Saxons or there was part of the Vikings and the Scandinavians had a Germanic element. So it's hard to know, but just overarchingly, um, yeah, the Dunbars are Germanic. And so then with Clan Donaghy, that claim has to be evaluated separately now because it looks like Clan Donaghy's tradition of descent is definitely from Crinan Abbot of Dunkeld. Um, and this is where it kind of gets into. I'm going to write a paper about this. I'm probably going to have it published because the reason this connects with my research is I am in charge of uh, the co-administrators of the Canal Owen project are given clades or subgroupings of the project they're in charge of. And so the group that I'm in charge of is called the Robertson Stranahan. Or I might be butchering the second last name. So if you look and it's spelled roughly like that. It's part of the Robertson Stranahan clade. And they're in this project because all of these people are matched the signature for Canal Owen from the O'Neills. Um, and I started looking. There's just a quick aside. There is a separate Clan Donaghy project that is run by the Clan Association and all that stuff. So this isn't affiliated with that, but there's people who are part of the project that I'm a part of, and the Clan Donaghy project. They're in both. And so I started looking, and I realized that there's at least one, but it looks like three testers who have documented descents from the Donaghy chiefly line who are who match the Canal Owen DNA signature. And so I started doing some research into that. And it's really interesting because that would seem to imply I started doing some research into like um, Crinan and like his ancestry and Clan Donaghy's descent. The overarching, like the bird's eye view of Clan Donaghy is that they're supposed to be descended from the Earls of Athol. who are supposed to be descended from a younger son of Creenan. That's the generic. If you look that up,
Yeah,
that's what all the clan
that's the
association stuff
narrative I'm
says.
familiar with for them.
Yeah. Um, and so I I'm working on a manuscript on that that's going to challenge some of those ideas. Um, I don't want to like leave it on a cliffhanger, but I don't know. I want to wait until I have like all
Yeah,
the information on that.
I think
But
that's wise and prudent. I think it's good. But
but
you're
it's
going to get a
really
lot of hate.
interesting.
You're going to get a lot of
I
hate
am.
because you're.
I know.
That's what this whole topic is going like right to the core of who people see themselves as, and you start getting too far in. Like you can watch like Neil King. He can like back going back to his involvement on the Facebook group. Man, people hate him. I don't. I think he's awesome, but he like people get on there and they just start throwing this like, yeah, I'm clan this and that because I'm this name and that, and he's like, oh yeah, and he's not even hateful about it. He's just like, you sure about
Yeah.
that? And they're like, oh, are you Mr. Smart? And they like get all wound up because this is deep for people. So you go around challenging this stuff, Ethan. Hang on.
No,
You don't
I am. I know. I'm ready for that, and I'm hoping I'm going to
good.
talk. I kind of have a plan for how I'm going to go about it, but I think in the end, like, it's scary in general when tradition isn't like what it seems to be. But I think my hope is that I think it's a more fruitful endeavor to learn how the tradition came about, and also sometimes the facts are more interesting than the fiction, which is what I'm hoping when I publish the article is that's what it's going to show, is that it's really it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's just different.
Yeah.
Um, so
I,
I'm
I
really
can't
excited
wait.
about that. Yeah, I wish I think it's I want to wait till I have all the research and I don't say anything that's maybe not totally accurate or based
Yep.
off of
It's
what's
good.
true from the
Totally
plantings.
support you in that. It's good
Um,
stuff.
so moving on, there's two more clans. Next one is the Stuarts, which I actually should have mentioned in the beginning with the Clan Donald and Clan Gregor as being one of the clans who has a mountain of information, genetic information on. Um, a lot of that comes from the fact that the Stuarts ended up becoming, kings of Scotland and later of Great Britain. So there's a lot of general interest in their DNA because the present royal family is descended from them and all that stuff. So the Stuarts have the unique claim of being the first clan that they identified the exact historical person that a Y-DNA mutation occurred in. And so the reason that that's hard to do, like I was talking about Summerled earlier, and I said they think that this is the mutation. So for this one, they're very confident on. The Summerled one is just based off of, well, if this mutation happened in this time and this is when Summerled lived, this is probably right. And the reason that it's very hard to do this is because what you need to is you need to have historically two brothers, and you need to show that the descendants of one brother all have one mutation, and if the descendants of the other brother do not, all of those descendants do not have that mutation. And then you can say that the brother's descendants with the mutation, it happened specifically in that brother, and you know that. And so what they were able to do that with was Alexander Stewart, who I believe is the fourth High Steward of Scotland. He had two sons, James Stewart and then John Stewart of Bunkle. Is that how you say it?
Yep.
B-U-N-K.
Yeah, his name comes up over and over
Uh,
again with the different branches of Stewarts.
right. And so Sir John Stewart of Bunkle is the individual who it was determined there is an identifying mutation that if you have this mutation, you are definitely descended from him. So it is RS781. And so if you have that, all of Sir John Stewart's descendant of Bunkle, his descendants all have that mutation. And Sir James Stewart, his brother, his descendants do not have that mutation. But both are descended from what is RL745. So if you've tested, obviously it's more likely if you're a Stewart, but at any point, if you take a Y-DNA test and you come back RL745, you are descended from the royal Stuart family to some extent,
That's
which
really
is,
interesting.
and as an aside, talking about, I guess, confirming or refuting tradition, the Stuarts are supposed to be descended from Bretons.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and as far as they can tell, it gets kind of muddy because, the Bretons were originally from, they were in England and then they moved to France and then they came back. So genetically, they're going to look pretty similar to the native Britons because they are the same people genetically. But as far as they can tell, this is the Stuart story lines up that they are descended from Bretons, and that thus, Alan Fitzflat is probably, probably was a Breton. Um, and so there's a lot of information on this, and there's actually a website called s781.org, which, if you recall, 781 is the marker that identifies Sir John Stuart of Bonkle. And they have a ton of information on they've identified markers for all of the descendants, the branches, Stuart of Appin and Stuart of Darnley, and all of those, which Stuart of Darnley leads to the English and British royal Stuarts. And then on Sir James Stuart's side, I don't have the name of it, but University of Strathclyde identified a marker that identifies descendants of King Robert III, I believe, of Scotland. So if you're a Stuart and you haven't taken a DNA test and know nothing about your your patriline, there's so much information on the Stuarts genetically, that you could pretty conclusively know what branch, if you are descended from the royal Stuarts, which I've seen. I think this figure is less than what it's reported to be. But the initial paper, not paper, but some news article came out and said that 50% of Stuarts are descended from the royal Stuart family. That sounds really high to me. But regardless, there's a significant portion of Stuarts who are in fact descended from the royal family. So I would say if you're a Stuart, definitely take a Y-DNA test and you'll learn a lot.
Is that possible with the Stuarts because they were so high profile, so they're much better documented than some of the other clans, and not even I was going to say obscure clans, but more remote clans.
Yeah, I don't know why that is. One thing this kind of gets into statistics in general, which is really interesting, is people say, there's actually a professor at UC Davis named Graham Coop who's done some like statistical models on this, of like what are the odds that you are descended from King Edward III of England. If you're English and you're born in like 1960, what are the odds you're descended from Edward III? And he does the math with the population at the time and his recorded descendants, and it's basically virtually 100%. Like,
Wow.
you, regardless of whether your immediate family were laborers or you're in the aristocracy, like regardless, if you're born in England in the 1960s and you're of English ancestry, you're almost certainly descended from Edward III.
Wow.
So, and the reason that is because it's not inherently because they're more famous or well known, but they're more prolific. And they moved around a lot more, and their descendants moved around a lot more because of dynastic marriages and stuff.
Hmm.
That their descendants become a lot more spread out versus, Highland clans in Caithness or something, or on in the Hebrides or Orkney, where they're pretty isolated,
Hmm.
and so their descendants are going to be concentrated in those areas versus with
Gotcha.
the Stuarts and the Plantagenets and other people, they spread out a lot.
So you have to like those ice. So if you're a McCaskill from the Isle of Skye or Lewis or something like that, and you're just kind of wait until that family tree branches out far enough that you can marry again, or don't wait in some
Yeah,
cases, I
basically.
guess. I'm not trying to
Yeah,
insult
the
the McCaskills, guys. I'm just saying, using them as an example.
the McDonald's didn't do that too well either.
Yeah, you keep on reading, not just with McDonald's, but several of these aristocratic Scottish families that they had to get a papal dispensation because they're going to marry their first cousin or something like that.
You know who's actually? I mean, I use the bad relative, not from necessarily a moral standpoint, but the Mackenzies are very constantly. If you look at Mackenzie genealogies for different branches of the clan, so many. I think it's a mistake, but it's like nope. Like some Mackenzie from one branch and married another the other branch, and their parents are also from different branches, and so the Mackenzie tree gets I think it's a lot more linear than people
Then
people
Branchy.
probably think. Yeah.
That's funny.
But
Well, they
I'm a
kept on.
descendant of I'm a descendant of the Mackenzie.
Are you? Okay. My wife is. My wife has zero interest in this whole topic. I will start because when you're this interested in it, you eventually you're going to bring it up sometime, and I'll start talking, and her eyes just glaze over, and I was like, "Gosh, who am I going to talk to about this?" I'll start a podcast, but she does have
It's not a
Mackenzie
bad way to go about
ancestors.
it.
Yeah, well, that's how I ended up talking to you, so I'm glad I did it. But the Mackenzies, I guess it didn't go too bad for them because they keep on producing very capable, sharp. You look, they're almost like a northern version of the Campbells, and I did a episode comparing them because they were super powerful, like the Campbells. They tended to take the government side. There were Jacobites and rebels and stuff like that, but they leaned a little bit more that way than some of the other Highland clans. There's a lot of parallels between the two, and one of them being they just kept on having very capable leadership that mattered a ton. So
Yeah, and
yeah, for whatever
it's
inbreeding.
interesting. Yeah, and my relationship with Mackenzies is actually, I mean, just very briefly, is my Mackenzies are actually from India.
Oh
Um,
wow,
my grandmother's family, my dad's mom was born in Bombay, actually.
wow,
And so I've had a heck of a time trying to trace I know my Mackenzie ancestor that came to India, but I don't know where in Scotland he's from.
mm,
I just know he's from Scotland. But I've used this is where you can use autosomal DNA testing. It's not conclusive and it can't tell you whether you're part of the chiefly line. But my father's taken an ancestor DNA test, and I have a whole lot of McLeod connections, and I don't know how, but I suspect that it's on my Mackenzie side.
yeah,
Uh, and I've found some Mackenzie matches too that kind of group together, and I think they're related on that side, and it's so frustrating because I think it's right there, but I don't quite know how where my Mackenzies are from in Scotland.
interesting. Not sure which branch. Not sure. They were heavily involved with the McLeods and would come to overtake Lewis from the McLeods, but so yeah, they're definitely intertwined. That's interesting. India. That's an that,
I there's actually a whole like I did some if you start doing some research into like Highland regiments in India and just part of the British Empire and the British Raj, it's actually really interesting. Something that's not talked about, and it's beyond the scope of this episode. But if you're interested, or people listening are interested in it, it's pretty interesting. And at least in America, which I think predominantly your audience is from, it's where I grew up.
yeah.
I never learned about any of that, and I did learn about that on my own. But it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, there you have it for some of our listeners. They're going to take that path. I think you're also doing wonders for these companies that have DNA testing. I think there's going to be, to the extent that I have any kind of how big my following is, which bigger than some and a lot smaller than others. But I think you're going to have a chunk of our listeners going to be heading that direction because you're making people curious about
Yeah,
their own. Go ahead.
I hope so. And that's kind of my whole I think that's where my passion is about this is that I've learned I think we're at a point with DNA testing that there's a lot more available than people are taking advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just by testing, even if you don't know a lot, you're helping the broader citizen scientist community. Like somebody joining these projects, typically the administrators are pretty knowledgeable, and so joining them, they are very willing to help you. And so even if you're listening and you don't know a lot about your own, patriline, but you have a Scottish last name and you're curious, taking a test and searching. You can also search without being on Family Tree DNA. You can search and see if your surname has a project, which all that means is that someone decided to basically create one with the company, and it's going to be a collection of people with your surname. If you test and you join the project, the administrator will most likely reach out to you, and you'll probably be able to learn something based off your genetics. So you don't even have to actually know much yourself, but just testing and getting your feet in the water is a great first step.
That's awesome. Yeah, I did mine through, I think I mentioned earlier that it was through Ancestry. That's yeah, I agree. This is so much interesting. And I think you've taught well what it's good for, what it's not good for, things to be careful, like conclusions to be careful about drawing from it, but still a lot of value in getting a DNA test for sure. Now were you going to hit Bruce of Clackmannan?
Yeah, before the last point. Yeah. So the last one, as Clint said, is Bruce of Clackmannan. Uh, and so there's a couple news articles that came out about this, about finding the genetic signature of Robert the Bruce. And so the reason I've titled it Bruce of Clackmannan is this is one where you have to be a little careful with how you say it. So if you're a student of Scottish history, you probably are aware that Robert the Bruce himself didn't have any like male great grandchildren. So there's no Bruces today with the surname Bruce that are patrilineally descended from Robert the Bruce. So at first, when I saw that headline of "We found Robert the Bruce's DNA signature," I started doing some digging because I knew it couldn't be from Robert the Bruce's descendants. This is also, by the way, from the University of Strathclyde. Um, and so what they did is the Bruce of Clackmannan branch of Clan Bruce is descended from the barons of Clackmannan. And so the earliest baron is Thomas Bruce. And his ancestry is pretty murky, but there's a general understanding that, and I did some research into this because the Wikipedia page, the sourcing on, there's only like two sources from it for Thomas Bruce, and I was trying to figure it out. And so there's competing opinions on how exactly Thomas Bruce is related to Robert the Bruce. Um, but either Thomas or his ancestor, well, the Wikipedia page, if you look it up, will say that Thomas, or it's either his ancestor John, who I don't think is confirmed historically. It's just that is the connection that he's given, that Thomas's ancestry is given into the clan Bruce. Either I think it's Thomas. In the Wikipedia article, it'll say was recognized by David Bruce or David II of Scotland as his next closest of kin. So that there was some connection. I couldn't find. I tried to track that down in the sources, and it might be there, and I might have missed it, but I couldn't find that. But there seems to be a general understanding that Thomas the Bruce of Clackmannan, and thus the barons of Clackmannan today, which I believe the Elgin branch is descended from, who is considered the chiefs of the clan now, are related to Robert the Bruce in some way patrilineally. It's just not well understood. Anyway, they figured out the Bruce genetic signature, which is again, just for listeners if they're curious, is RFTB 15831. And so it's hard
RFTB.
to
Say that again.
sorry, yeah. FTB 15831.
1 5. Oh, he paused. He's still there. Might be
It's
having a
slower,
little.
but
Hey, Ethan, the video cut right there. Um,
oh, sorry.
right when
Yeah.
you're repeating which was the genetic the mutation. RFTB
It
15831.
831.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry about that.
No, the video cut off. I think the later into the evening we go, I think the internet
Yeah, more
might
people are.
Yeah, yeah, bandwidth or whatever.
Um,
I don't know if that's the right term, but keep on going, Coach. So you're teaching us about the Bruces. So like, let me make sure I'm with you so far. Okay, so Robert
yeah,
the Bruce doesn't have any. You get so many generations down. That's why it went to the Stewarts because you ran out of male
right.
guys from him. But what they did is they went upstream from him and found that genetic group.
Yeah, but
Okay.
it's a little less clear cut than that because there was a contemporaneous Bruce family to Robert the Bruce that had a tradition of descent or a tradition of kinship with Robert the Bruce. And it seems to have been known by the royal Bruce family at the time that these Bruces were related. So it's not quite just hearsay.
Okay.
Um,
Because you're hitting on a question
but
that I
they,
had because the Bruces were connected to Annandale, Southwest, and had intermarried with the elite Gallic groups down there. Robert the Bruce was probably a Gallic speaker. I mean, almost certainly was a Gallic speaker. So this is so what they're going off of is another group that was acknowledged or believed to be connected. Yeah.
yeah, or the
Okay.
closest kin, the closest male kin to
Okay.
the royal Bruces. So that's where this genetic data comes from. And this is, like I said, is from the University of Strathclyde. And they're of the opinion that he's related patrilineal to Robert, their family is related to Robert the Bruce, and I would defer to them, and they're much more knowledgeable than I am. But it just seems to be, generally speaking, the exact pedigree, which the researchers at Strathclyde acknowledge is not totally known.
Gotcha.
Um, but if you're a Bruce, again, and if you take a DNA test and match that, um, you would be descended from the Bruces of Clackman.
Interesting. Good stuff, man. This is so interesting. So good. I'm so glad we decided to do this. Um, okay, are we ready to go to number
Yeah, the
4?
last, yeah,
Because we're going to flip it, right? Instead of confirming or refuting a tradition, we're going to talk about DNA teaching us things that don't have a tradition and connections
right.
that weren't assumed.
So this one is a lot more um, like cutting edge, I'd say, or pioneering. So, and like as the question implies, are there any clans that are genetically related but don't have a tradition of shared descent? Would imply that there aren't historical records for it. So it's really hard to. I'm not sure where researchers should go from here exactly about how to make something of it. But I found one cluster of it ended up being 5 clans that are related that don't have a tradition of descent, but and I have to qualify this. The so all of these most of the clans I've talked about, when we talk about related, we say in a genealogically relevant time frame,
Okay,
which means that
right.
it would right. And so this cluster of clans that are related are right on that edge. Um, so uh, for example, when you say that like Bruce, or sorry, the McNeils of Bar and the McNeils of Gia aren't related, they're related like they're common ancestors like 3,500 years ago or something,
Sure.
but
Like
it's
you,
not the tradition.
yeah, if you go back
Yeah,
far
go ahead.
enough, all of them are connected somehow.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so this marker is called RS744. And so scientists have dated its existence, or I guess its occurrence, to 400 AD. So that's kind of it's a little before surname. Well, not a little. It's a pretty substantial amount before surnames, but it's definitely in Scotland, and it's kind of on that. I think that's an interesting time period because it's like kind of as Roman Britain
Yep.
is crumbling. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So the clans that all descend have, basically, to put it in layman's terms, the clans that all have the chiefly lines of the clans that all seem to be related around 400 AD are McGregor, Buchanan, McPherson, McLaren, and McRae. Um, and these clans actually fall into 2 slightly smaller groupings. So McGregor and Buchanan are slightly more closely related, and then McPherson, McLaren, and McRae are slightly more closely related. Um, and so when I say slightly, McGregor and Buchanan share a common ancestor estimated to be around 450 AD, and then McPherson, McLaren, and McRae share a common ancestor who's been estimated to have lived around 550 AD. And I have an interesting family interjection for me personally is that mentioned how my Dinning family is not descended from a clan, but my Dinning family also branches off the same McPherson, McLaren, McRae grouping um, from that period of 550 AD, which I think is really interesting. And again, it's hard to say. If you look up, if you're Buchanan and you're listening, I actually remember seeing one of the listeners, I believe, or he was in the Facebook group, is very active in the Clan Buchanan Association. Um, they actually talk about this a lot, about their tradition of descent and how it's not exactly what the tradition reports, but they acknowledge on their website the strange connection with the McGregors. And so I was trying to figure out, like, I don't think all of those five clans are from the same area. That's kind of where I was trying to go with it, and I couldn't quite figure. I didn't see an obvious connection. One strange connection for me, like I said, my Dinning family. Um, the consensus between me and another cousin I've met in Scotland is that our Dinning surname comes from the town of Dunning in Perth, and the McLarens are from Perth.
Yeah, the Highland portion of
So
it.
yeah, and so I thought maybe there was a connection there, but as far as the actual clans, I mean, I'd be curious. I don't know if you have any thoughts or anything jumps out between the clan names, but I yeah, go ahead.
No, finish your sentence, sir.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say the only thing I thought that was interesting. Well, the reason I go ahead because I was gonna go into segue about not segue, but I was gonna go on from what the mutation means like a little earlier.
Okay, so just you asked my initial thoughts, and you brought up geography. So when we talk about McRae, are we talking about the ones that were helped hold Donan Castle for the
Buchanan,
Mackenzies?
yeah,
That
the
group, because
Queens, I guess.
that's another one that was there was you can find a similar and linguistically connected last name in Ireland, but genetically unrelated. And I imagine if that's the case, then there's probably others. But that because I was thinking geography or geographically when you as you're describing this. So McGregor and Buchanan, the homeland of the McGregors is up there at the head of it's by now that I'm trying to say it, all of the place names are uh, are just leaving
Stray.
me.
Yeah.
Glen Stray is that's a home country, but a later branch established themselves in Glen Gyle, and that's I think that's the one that Rob Roy's from. Is the Glen Gyle one,
I
and
think
at
that's
least
right.
that's where
I
he
think
was
that's right.
buried. I think is in Glen Gyle, and that borders. So this is all like with my McFarlands. This is all in that neighborhood. So across the McFarlands on the northwest, the Cahoons were immediately south. Across in the northeast of Loch Lomond, that's where Glen Gyle is, and then just south, so neighboring, and would be the Buchanan territory. So geographically, that branch of the McGregors were close. And then I don't know what conclusions you draw from that. I just know that I can picture the map in my head. And then McLaren isn't too far from either of those. On the and I weren't is that Balquidder that they're like on the
So that one I'm not sure about.
yeah.
I that sounds right, but
And then but then you go farther to get to McPherson's, you got to go up to Badenoch, which is a little farther north than that. There's some terrain in between from as you go north, and then but then the McRae, that's even farther, and that's more northwest and out on the west coast. But McGregor,
it's hard.
Buchanan, and McLaren, that they're all in the ballpark, especially that branch of the McGregors. Go ahead.
So there's the one of the ancestors of RS 744, which it's in a way it's strange to call them by their number because it's a man in history. We just don't know their name.
Yeah.
Um, but his ancestor RL 1065. There's a lot of conjecture. I haven't seen a lot of research on it. There's a book by Gene Manko called Blood of the Celts, I think, that talks about it. But it's really hard to, this information comes out so quickly and gets updated and outdated that it's really hard to publish books in this subject. Um, but there's talk that L 1065 represents a Pictish signature, based off of the groupings of people that are from there. And at one point, it was claimed that RL 1065 was related to the House of Dalriada. Um, I don't think that's correct because that family is supposed to be Irish. And I think people are tending to stray away from that thought now. And so people think that it represents, basically, the simplest way to put it is that these five clans probably represent a native Pictish ancestry.
That is interesting. That, Ethan, for a long time now, ever since I wrapped up that thesis and kept on thinking about stuff, my suspicion was that there are more clans that that would pertain to than whose origin stories would indicate. As the Because you got this fusion of the leading kindred of Dalriada, specifically Canale Navrine, maybe under Viking pressure, but certainly during that time period, pushing east. The Pictish royal family has, like there's a couple of brothers from the Pictish royal family that had to take refuge in Ireland for a while, probably came back very Gallicized. The cultural influences are already starting to creep in. The intermarriages between Dalriada, the Picts, the Pictish royal house, Fortru, whatever organization you want to call it, Britons of Strathclyde, and even the Angles of Northumbria, they've been intermarrying with each other for a while now. So you have the center of gravity for Dalriada to push east, rebrand, right? They don't use Dalriada anymore. They eventually, not too many generations after this movement, you have kings of Alba, or actually Kenneth MacAlpin and his immediate successors were recognized as kings of the Picts. And there's been a lot of, like you
Right,
talking about,
Alex
a lot
Wolf
of,
talks about that.
yes, he does. Um, and the reason I'm bringing that up is, so it's not like the Gaels just pushed east and slaughtered all the Picts. You would have had, if we're using later events as maybe an indicator of earlier events that are less well documented, we, like with the Normans coming in, one thing that they did very quickly was intermarry with the elite families that already existed. The Bruces are a perfect example of that. But anyway, you have this Gallicization of people who already lived there and are recognized, at least from our looking back, as Picts. My suspicion is there's several clans that we recognize today during this time period we often think about and talk about with the clans of Scotland, who really go back to Pictish ancestors, but it became fashionable to be, just like you were talking about with the MacDonalds, or the MacNeils, it was fashionable to be tied back to Ireland. Even Robert the Bruce and the Declaration of Arbroath, they really hit on this strong connection and this element of continuity back there. But in reality, I wonder how many of these prominent families who become clans in their own right tie back into really, they descend from elite Pictish families who are Gallicized, maybe modified their origin stories, and now it's hard to tell until you start getting into what you're sharing with us now about these. I just think that's fascinating. So we have McGregor, Buchanan, McPherson, McLaren, and McRae, correct? And
Yeah.
your conclusion, that, just to restate it, is that it looks like they may be descended from Pictish families because they don't tie in well with
Yeah, that's
known
the general
Dalriada
conclusion.
kindreds.
And again, just to be the scholarly side, is that's to say that their patriline's don't align with Gaelic ancestry, and that their patrilines are Pictish. I would say it's probably likely. I've read some interesting like papers on. A lot of it has to do with moved peoples into Britain with the like Anglo Saxons and all those people, and there's archaeologists and historians frequently debate whether a culture is introduced by a ruling elite, and that's why it looks like it changes, or if a people migrated and disrupted the gene pool. Um, and so far, for a long time, all we've had to go on for centuries is archaeology, based off of pots or the cultures and all that stuff. But now we have genetic information, which is showing that it's not the pendulum has been kind of was shifted initially. It was all of these changes are always people moving. That was for a couple centuries, and then in the 1950s or so, it became fashionable to say that no one really moved, but it was just cultural diffusion. And now genetics has really muddied the water of, well, sometimes it was uh, like there was, I think, the Neolithic population in Britain, the bell beakers like almost genetically wiped out the incoming population. Um, but then you get other cases where it's the primarily is culture. And so it is really interesting. Obviously, from the date 400 AD, that's too early to say. There's not going to be any historical record or clan or people that you could look to say that they're related. Um, but one thing I did remember is that, because I remember this about the town of Dunning and the McLarens in general, is that that area of Perth is very close to Fortru, which is one of the Pictish kingdoms.
Yeah.
Um, and so, at least for the McLarens, it looks like that the McLarens did come from, just geographically, Pictish area, if they are originally from the place where they sprung up, with Robert the Bruce, the Battle of Bannockburn. Um, so that was something that stood out to me that I thought was interesting. But exactly like you said, and this kind of ties back to the beginning too, that genealogies were political. It wasn't necessarily about knowing accurately where your family came from, is being able to tell others where your family came from to support a position.
Mm-hmm.
So one of like the most blatant examples of this, which is well documented, is the Mackenzies. That the Mackenzies are
Yeah.
supposed to be descended from Colin Fitzgerald and the Normans. Um, but the MS 1467 uh, Gaelic manuscript says they're descended from Cormac MacAbertach. Um, and there's a lot of interesting thoughts. And that's actually a perfect example of the whole patriline issue, that patrilineally, the Mackenzies are Gaelic. And so there was some support for Cormac MacAbertach in that descent. But the Clan Mackenzie Society released a book called, I think it's May We All Be Britons. And they argue for a non-patrilineal descent from Colin Fitzgerald, and how both stories, the MS 1467 and the Colin Fitzgerald descent, could be true. It's just not patrilineal. Um, but that's a great example where, and the Clanes did this too, where they claimed Norman ancestry, and all these clans in like the 1600s started claiming Norman ancestry. And people now are saying, well, hold on, I think that's because
Yeah.
it was fashionable to be Norman then. But people, I don't think, are extending that back as far as like, well, it wasn't fashionable to be Pictish if you go farther back, and it was fashionable to be Gallic.
Yep.
So I think people should be questioning the Gallic genealogies as much as they question the later Norman ones. Because like you're saying, is if the Picts were natives to, or more native to Scotland than the Gaels from Dalriada are, they didn't disappear. Like, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure they intermarried with Gallic royal dynasties. So I think your suspicion is right that as this happens, there will be more Pictish, patrilineally Pictish clans that do not have a tradition of descent in that nature.
Really interesting point. And I think I follow the logic. I'm in. I really like that point. Okay. To the last thing you had on your topics here was tell us about the McBains and the McBain, and the McPhersons.
Oh, so that one was related to
Oh,
RS 744.
gotcha.
Um,
I just
I
didn't. Did
did
you
do
talk
some
about the
more.
McBains or the McBains very much in there?
I didn't
Okay.
because I saw that online, but then I started to do more research into, is the McBain chiefly line identified genetically in like in a like confidently. I couldn't find that. And
Okay.
so I didn't want to include, I was trying to stick to stuff that, and there's actually even stuff in here genetically about clans that are known that just for the sake of time I didn't include.
Okay.
But there's some really
Perfect.
interesting stuff on the Hamiltons, other clans genetically about tradition and stuff. That's also really interesting.
Well, hey, no, and I think that's valuable to just even though like I can totally see why you skipped it, but then right there to even just say, hey, this is why I skipped it. Because here's where I'm at in my process and my understanding. So it's valuable. Ethan, I've this is the a pretty long episode. We'll probably end up cutting this up and digesting, like throwing it out in more digestible chunks. But man, that was interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
go ahead. Concluding
It's
remarks.
I Yeah, again, just this is something I find really interesting, and for me it's been full circle with my interest in Scottish clans because I going to the Scottish games as a kid uh kind of instilled that interest in me, but I felt that there were stories I heard and stuff that, or with tartans, and I wondered the same thing with surnames. I'm like, this doesn't quite feel right. And so it's been cool to get involved in the academic side. And the reason I heard about the podcast is I was listening to Bruce Fumey on Scottish History Tours, and he shouted out your podcast. And before that, I was a big, I love listening to podcasts, listen to a lot of different like history ones and stuff. And when all I needed to hear was Scottish clans and academic, and that sold me. And so I started listening, and I've learned a lot listening to the podcast, and I'm really honored that I'm able to contribute to it in some manner, because I think this is a topic that's really interesting and that is going to be the future of not just Scottish clan research, but just our understanding of historical patriarchal systems, and to see whether what DNA can tell us about them in general and from the past.
That brilliant, brilliant, and we're grateful to have you. We're our community that mean the podcast, the Facebook group. We're richer for having you be a part of our group, and for everybody who's listening to this, you were Ethan was you. He he was just new into this community, and he was hungry, and I'm not saying that a good thing for him that he joined. I'm just saying, what value are you bringing in here that if you're one of the listeners, what comment are you gonna throw up on the not throw up like vomit, but throw up on the the Facebook group, that's going to be valuable. Sometimes it's a beginner asking a good question that really kicks things off, or sometimes one of you might be super knowledgeable about, like with Ethan here with the DNA stuff. Like I don't, he just shared way more than I'm qualified to talk about, but Ethan, we're grateful you came on. Yeah, super interesting. I hope the audience appreciated the time that we spent together here, because I think you shared a lot of things that I think are pertinent. They're relevant. They're relevant right now to people. They're things they're wondering. People are all the time coming on here making comments about hey, I got a test and here's what it is. And now we've got somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, instead of me and maybe a handful of others going, I don't know. You're actually able to unpack it and talk more intelligently about it. So Ethan, thank you so much for coming on here. I look forward to more interaction with you in the future, and to everybody else, I appreciate it. We'll sign off, but thank you, Ethan. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. I appreciate it.